Some stories begin with rules written in blood and bone, and Adela Dave had followed every single one, which made it rather ironic that the one rule she was about to break would cost her everything she had, and give her everything she never dared want. They say the smallest mercy can undo a kingdom. As it turned out, Adela's mercy would undo something far more stubborn than that. A boy who had been taught that survival mattered more than kindness, and a future that had been written without her name in it. It begins on a night when the cold had teeth. Snow fell in thick, silent sheets as Adela cut through the back edge of the Ironvale Pack's territory. Head down, cloak pulled tight, taking the shortcut she wasn't supposed to take. Her satchel was full dried wolfsbane, crushed yarrow, a fresh bundle of fever moss she'd traded 3 days' worth of kitchen shifts to get. Elder Harwick's youngest had been running a temperature since morning, and Adela had been up since before dawn preparing the remedy. For the pack, Sarah had reminded her that morning, eyes warm with something that might have been admiration or might have been pity. You do it all for the pack, and they never even say your name right. Adela had not answered that. There was nothing useful in answering it. The wind sharpened. She recognized this kind of cold, the kind that stopped being weather and started being warning. The storm the elders had been watching for all week was arriving faster than their predictions, and she was still 20 minutes from the pack settlement with a satchel full of herbs that needed to stay dry. She picked up her pace, boots punching through the crust of old snow, breath clouding white in front of her face. Then she heard it. Low, broken, wrong. Adela stopped walking. There it was again, not quite a whimper, not quite a cry. Something smaller than both and more desperate than either. The sound of something alive that did not expect to stay that way. Pack law on strays was older than Elder Harwick and carved into the same stone as the territory markers. Wolves from outside the border were not pack. They were not owed warmth or aid or the attention of a healer. They were left where they fell. Adela set her satchel down at the base of a snow-capped oak. She pushed through the tree line, 10 paces off the path, 15, 20, and found him. A wolf pup lay crumpled against an exposed root, half buried in snow, one foreleg bent at an angle that made her stomach drop. He was silver-gray, darker along the spine, and he was enormous. Far too large for his age, her healer's mind noted automatically, the kind of size that didn't come from ordinary bloodlines. His breathing came in shallow, uneven pulls. Blood had frozen in the fur along his flank, rust dark against the silver, and the wound beneath it had an edge to it she recognized with cold dread. Ragged, deep, and already showing the faint gray discoloration of something worse than a blade. He'd been poisoned. How far had he come? How long had he been lying here in the dark while the temperature dropped and the snow covered him in increments, patient as a burial? Adela looked up at the sky. The storm was accelerating. She could feel it in the pressure behind her eyes, in the way the trees had gone completely still. In another 30 minutes, this part of the forest would be impassable. Anyone caught out here would not make it back. Even a wolf shifter, even a royal one, and something about the size of him, the particular architecture of his bone structure visible even through the fur, whispered that word at her insistently. She looked back down at him. His eyes were open, just barely, silver-gray irises, glassy with pain, catching the faint light between the trees. He was looking at her with the focused, fading attention of a creature deciding whether she was a threat or a miracle. His breathing was a thread. Adela had spent 5 years being useful to people who would not grieve her if she disappeared. She had cleaned wounds and set bones and sat with the dying through the long hours, and no one had ever once thought to ask if she was tired. She had learned to be invisible the way water learns the shape of a container, completely without complaint. She was very, very tired of being the thing that was used and left. But this wolf had not used her. This wolf did not even know her name. And he was going to die in 30 minutes if she kept standing here having feelings about it. Absolutely not, Adela said, to no one, to the storm, to the particular cruelty of a world that kept handing her situations like this one. She crouched, worked her arms beneath the wolf's body, and lifted. He was heavier than anything she had ever carried. The weight of him settled across her shoulders like a second gravity, pressing down through her spine, her knees, into the frozen ground. Her legs shook. She steadied. 5 years of hauling medicinal stores, restocking the pack's supply shelves, carrying injured wolves on field litters through terrain that didn't allow for anything gentler. She was stronger than she looked. She had always been stronger than she looked. Adela Dave turned her back on the pack settlement, faced the deep forest, and began to walk. She did not know yet whose heir she was carrying. She did not know that by morning she would have no pack to return to. She did not know that the boy inside this wolf, lean, dark-eyed, royal-blooded, already beginning to owe her a debt he would spend the rest of his life trying to repay, would one day stand in front of an entire kingdom and say her name like it was the most important word he had ever been given. She only knew the wolf was breathing. For now, that was enough. She made it back in 40 minutes. She did not remember all of them. There were gaps, stretches where the cold had gotten into her thinking and she was moving more by muscle than by mind. One foot finding the next patch of ground, arms locked around the wolf's body out of sheer refusal to let go. The trees thinned. The familiar outline of her shelter materialized through the snow. A small stone structure at the far edge of pack territory, half overgrown, assigned to her 3 years ago because no one else wanted it and healers needed to be close to the forest anyway. She had never minded the isolation. Tonight, for the first time, she was grateful for it. She got the door open with her shoulder, got the wolf through it, got him down onto the floor mat without dropping him, though the last part was closer to a controlled collapse than anything she would have called graceful. Her knees hit the ground beside him. Her arms were shaking in a way she couldn't stop. She didn't stop. She was already reaching for her satchel. He was still breathing. That was the only fact that mattered. She worked through the night, cleaned the wound with the yarrow and what little clean water she had, packed the poisoned edges with fever moss. Not a cure, but a slowdown, a way of buying the body time to fight what the blade had put into it. His temperature was a furnace beneath her hands. She covered him with the heaviest blanket she owned, built the fire up until the small room was stifling, and sat cross-legged on the floor beside him with her back against the wall and her eyes on the rise and fall of his ribs. She did not sleep. By the time pale, grudging light began to press through the shuttered window, his breathing had steadied into something she trusted more. Not safe. Not even close to safe. But no longer the sound of a body actively giving up. She let herself exhale fully for what felt like the first time in hours. The knock at her door came 7 minutes later. She knew who it was before she opened it. Beta Marin Voss had a particular knock. Efficient and hard, 3 strikes, the sound of someone who did not expect to be made to wait. Adela opened the door. Marin stood in the pale morning with 2 pack sentinels behind her and an expression that managed to be both cold and satisfied. The look of someone who had been waiting for exactly this. Her eyes moved past Adela to the wolf on the floor. "I thought so," Marin said. They brought her before Elder Harwick as the sun finished rising. The great room of the pack hall was empty except for the inner council. 6 faces Adela had known her whole life, arranged around the long table with the careful gravity of people about to do something they had already decided. Marin stood to the side. She did not look at Adela. Harwick asked her to explain herself. Adela explained herself. She said, "He would have died within the hour, and she is a healer, and leaving a living creature to die in the snow on a technicality of territory is not something she is capable of doing, and she would not pretend otherwise to make this easier for anyone in the room. She did not beg. It would not have helped, and she had never been good at it." Harwick listened. He was not an unkind man. That almost made it worse. The gentleness in his voice when he told her that the laws existed for reasons older than either of them, that pack safety required hard lines, and that a healer who could not hold those lines was a liability, not an asset. He said it like he was sorry. She believed him. It did not change anything he said next. She was given 1 hour. She packed what fit into a single bag and did not look at the walls of the shelter she had spent 3 years making livable. Looking at it would not help. Sarah was waiting at the pack gate, which was not allowed and which Sarah had clearly decided not to care about. Her eyes were red. She pressed a satchel into Adela's hands. Herbs, bandages, a small jar of the anti-poison compound they had been making together for the past month, and grabbed her by the wrist and did not say anything because there was nothing to say that would be adequate. Adela held on for 3 seconds. Then she let go because she had to. The gate closed. From behind her, she heard the soft crunch of uneven footsteps in the snow. She turned. The wolf had made it out before the latch caught. Limping badly, head low but moving. He came to stand beside her outside the wall like it had been the plan all along. Adela looked at him for a moment. Then she turned toward the forest and walked. The cave was not much. A split in the rock face 2 miles past the territory markers. Hidden behind a fall of snow-laden pine branches that she nearly walked past twice before the particular quality of the dark behind them registered as depth rather than shadow. She pushed through. High enough to stand in, wide enough that the wolf could stretch without touching both walls, with a natural channel in the stone floor that would pull smoke outward if she built the fire at the right angle. She had slept in worse places. She had not, technically, slept in many places, but the principle stood. She got the fire going with the flint from her bag and the driest branches she could find without going far from the entrance. Her hands were steady. She had noticed years ago that her hands were always steadiest when things were at their worst. Some inversion of the natural order that she had learned to be grateful for. The wolf had followed her the entire 2 miles. She still wasn't certain how, on that leg. She had stopped twice to check the limb and once to rewrap the wound on his flank. And each time he had stood for it with the focused patience of someone who understood what was being done and had decided to trust it. When they reached the cave, he walked in ahead of her and lay down in the far corner like he had been here before. Like he was choosing the spot. She cleaned his wounds again by firelight with what she had left. The anti-poison compound Sarah had packed was doing something. The gray discoloration was no longer spreading, which was not the same as gone but was better than the alternative. She repacked the wound, changed the moss, pulled the heaviest of her 2 spare wraps over his back and tucked it against his sides with the brisk efficiency of someone who could not afford sentiment right now. Then she sat back against the cave wall and the silence arrived. It was enormous. The kind of silence that had texture, the muffled density of snow-covered forest, the faint pop of the fire, the wolf's uneven breathing. Adela had spent a large portion of her life alone and had made a reasonable peace with it, but this silence was different. This was the silence of a door that had closed and would not reopen. She started talking. Sarah had taught her that, actually, had read it somewhere in one of the old healing texts she was always borrowing from Adela's shelf, the idea that patients in fever responded to a familiar voice, that sound was an anchor the body could hold onto while it was too busy fighting to hold onto anything else. It was good practice, clinical, an entirely sensible reason to speak into the dark. She told him about her mother first. It was the thing she thought about when she was tired, which she was deeply past the point of physical. Her mother had been an outsider too, a wandering healer from a pack 2 territories east who had come through Ironvale during a hard winter and stayed because of a man who later decided staying was not for him. She had died when Adela was 7, of an ordinary fever that should not have been fatal and was, because the pack healer at the time had been slow to respond to an outsider's child. Adela had decided to learn everything that healer knew, and then more than that, and then more than that, until no one could ever again say that slowness was the only option available. She told him about the particular arithmetic of being useful but not wanted. How you learned to make yourself small in the ways that protected you and large in the ways that served others until you couldn't always remember which parts of yourself were real and which were armor. How she had been healing pack members for 5 years and still ate alone every night and still was not included in the winter gathering prayers and still had to trade shifts for basic supplies instead of simply being given them. She wasn't saying it for sympathy. She was saying it because it was the truth, and he was the first person, the first creature, in a very long time who could hear it without using it against her. His ears moved when she spoke. small adjustments tracking her voice. On the fourth day, the fever broke. She woke with a start from a shallow sleep and pressed her hand to his flank and felt the difference immediately. The terrible furnace heat gone, his skin cool and damp, his breathing long and even. On the fifth day, she looked up from grinding the last of her yarrow and found his eyes fully open, clear, and fixed on her with an attention that was not animal at all. Something in them was watching her think. It happened on a gray morning between one breath and the next. Adela had her back to him. She was feeding the fire with the last of the wood she'd gathered the evening before, calculating how far she could stretch it against how cold the day looked through the cave entrance, when she heard the shift. Not a sound exactly, more an absence of sound, the particular silence of something large and present becoming something differently present. The quality of the air in the cave changed. She felt it before she understood it. She turned around. A boy sat in the corner where the wolf had been. Lean and pale, dark-eyed, perhaps 16 or 17, with black hair that fell across his forehead in damp, uneven pieces. He was wearing nothing, which she processed clinically and immediately stopped looking at, her gaze going to his face and staying there with great deliberateness. There was a scar along his collarbone, fresh, still pink at the edges, following the exact line she had been treating for 5 days. His hands were braced against the cave floor. He was looking at her with the same fixed, evaluating attention the wolf had turned on her yesterday, and for a moment neither of them moved. Then he said quietly, "You didn't leave." Adela set the piece of wood she was holding down with care. "Obviously," she said. He stared at her for another moment. Something shifted in his expression. Not quite relief, not quite surprise. Something between the two that looked like it didn't get much practice on his face. She retrieved her spare wool shirt and her second pair of leggings from her bag and set them on the cave floor between them without comment. Then turned back to the fire and gave him the privacy of her back while he worked out what to do with them. The shirt would be too short and the leggings would be too narrow in the shoulders when he wore them wrong. But they were better than the alternative, and she suspected he knew that. When she turned back, he was dressed and sitting straighter, his hands loose in his lap, watching her with that same unnerving steadiness. He told her his name first. Thomas Boyd. He said it plainly, without decoration, and then waited to see what it did to her face. She kept her face neutral and nodded once because she knew the name, everyone in every pack within 3 territories knew the name, and because the alternative was making a scene which she had never seen the use of. He told her about the ambush. Efficient, factual, no self-pity in it. He had ridden out ahead of his escort on a scouting route that only his inner circle knew, and they had been waiting for him. 3 of them, blades poisoned with the compound that disrupted shifter healing. He had run because he was outnumbered and not because he was afraid, he said, and Adela believed both halves of that sentence. He had been running for 2 days by the time she found him. She listened to all of it without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment, sorting the information into its implications the way she sorted herbs, by what it meant, what it changed, what it required of her now. Then she told him she had been exiled. She said it simply, the same way he had told her about the ambush. The pack had seen her carry him in. The beta had reported it to the elder. She'd been given 1 hour and a closed gate. She had nowhere to return to. She watched it land on him. He went very still, the particular stillness of someone absorbing a blow they hadn't seen coming, recalculating the shape of something they thought they understood. His jaw tightened. "Because of me," he said. "Because of the law," she said. "You didn't make the law." He looked like he wanted to argue with that. He didn't, which she respected. They sat in a silence that was different from all the previous silences. Fuller, somehow, weighted with the specific gravity of 2 people who had just handed each other something real and were waiting to see what the other one did with it. The soldiers found them 3 hours after dark. 6 of them, royal markings on their cloaks, torches cutting through the tree line with the organized urgency of people who had been searching for days and were not allowing themselves to feel relieved yet. They pushed through the pine branches and stopped in the cave entrance and stared. Thomas Boyd, the Alpha King's heir, was sitting cross-legged by a fire in a borrowed wool shirt. Adela Dave, exiled pack healer, was sitting across from him braiding her hair. An empty bowl sat between them. The fire was burning low and even. The lead soldier opened his mouth. "He needs another 2 days before he travels," Adela said, without looking up. "The poison compound requires a full week to clear. If you move him before then you risk a relapse, and a relapse of this particular venom in a shifter who has already been weakened will do permanent damage to the healing response." 2 days. The soldier looked at Thomas. Thomas looked at Adela with something in his expression she didn't have a name for yet. 2 days, he confirmed. The soldiers had, in fact, intended to leave her there. She could see it in the way they organized themselves on the morning of departure, the careful choreography of it, the horses positioned for Thomas, the supply pack redistributed, the lead soldier's eyes moving over the cave entrance with the expression of a man completing a checklist. Adela had her bag on her shoulder and was watching this with the detached clarity she applied to most things she couldn't control, already calculating which direction would give her the best shelter options heading south, when Thomas appeared at her elbow. He looked at the lead soldier. "She comes with us," he said. Not a question, not a request. The tone of someone for whom the alternative had not been a serious consideration. The soldier, a broad, careful man named Dreist who had the look of someone who had been managing complicated situations for a long time, glanced at Adela, then back at Thomas, and performed a rapid internal negotiation that she could watch happening behind his eyes. "My lord, the outcast is not our. She comes with us," Thomas said again, in exactly the same tone. Dreist looked at Adela one more time. She looked back at him with an expression that communicated clearly that this was not her idea, and he should feel free to take it up with the 16-year-old who had already stopped listening. Someone produced a royal travel cloak, heavy gray wool lined, with the Boyd crest at the clasp, and held it out to her with the stiff courtesy of a man following an order he hadn't been given before. She put it on. It was warmer than anything she had ever owned, and she hated how much she noticed that. The journey east took 4 days. She spent most of them on a horse she hadn't asked for, wrapped in a cloak she hadn't asked for, moving toward a destination she hadn't asked for, and Thomas spent most of them riding close enough that she was never quite alone with her discomfort, which she suspected was deliberate and chose not to address. The palace arrived like a statement. She had known it was large. Everyone knew it was large. But there was a difference between knowing a thing and watching it materialize at the end of a road at dusk. The towers catching the last light, the walls the color of old bone, the sheer mass of it pressing against the sky with the calm arrogance of something that had been there longer than anyone's objections. Adela kept her face arranged and her breathing even and did not let herself react to any of it, which cost her more effort than she would have liked. The court looked at her the way courts looked at problems that had arrived through the wrong door. She could feel it the moment they entered, the assessment, the categorization, the quick social arithmetic of rank and origin and what is she doing here running behind every set of eyes that tracked them through the entrance hall. She was wearing a borrowed cloak over a 5-day-old shirt and her boots still had forest mud in the seams. She walked like she belonged regardless because the only alternative was to walk like she didn't, and she had made that mistake once in her life and learned from it. The Alpha King received them in a room that was smaller than she'd expected and more serious. No decoration for its own sake, maps on the walls, a fire built for function rather than atmosphere. He was a tall man, broad through the shoulders, with Thomas's dark eyes set in a face that had 20 more years of decisions in it. He looked at his son for a long time with an expression that had relief at its core and everything else layered over the top of it. Then he looked at Adela. The look lasted 4 seconds. She counted. It was not unfriendly. It was not warm. It was the look of a man who had encountered something he didn't have an existing category for and was reserving judgment until he'd gathered more information. She could work with that. She had spent her whole life being a thing people didn't have categories for. Thomas, across the room, looked at her differently. She noticed it in fragments over the days that followed, catching it at the edges of moments when she wasn't expecting to be observed. Over a meal she'd been uncomfortably seated at. In the corridor outside the healer's wing when she'd gotten turned around, and he'd appeared to redirect her without making her feel lost. Across the courtyard one morning when she'd stopped to watch the sparring practice and looked up to find him already watching her. He looked at her like she was an answer. She had spent enough time around sick people to know that the mind did strange things during fever. It formed attachments, assigned significance, remembered faces with unearned intensity. It was a documented phenomenon, physiological, entirely explicable. She told herself that every time. It had been 3 weeks since his fever broke, and she was still telling herself that, and it was becoming, with each repetition, slightly less convincing. It started with a map. Thomas had been given one by his father's war council, a detailed rendering of the route he'd taken the day of the ambush, marked up with the positions of the attackers as best as the surviving escort member had been able to reconstruct them. Thomas had been carrying it folded in his jacket for days, taking it out and looking at it and putting it away again, and Adela had watched him do this twice before she said anything. On the third evening, she said, "Show me." They sat on the floor of the small receiving room that had become, by a process of quiet default, the place they met when the palace's formality became too much to breathe in, close to the fire, the map spread between them on the stone, a lamp pulled close enough to read by. Thomas walked her through it. The route, the timing, the exact point on the road where the trees thickened on both sides and the path narrowed and 3 armed wolves had been waiting with the patient, prepositioned stillness of people who had known exactly how long they had to wait. Adela looked at the map for a long time without speaking. Then she said, "Who knew the route?" Thomas was quiet. "Before you left," she said, keeping her voice even and clinical. The tone she used when the answer to a question was going to require the patient to hold still for something unpleasant. "Who had access to your schedule? The specific road, the timing, the fact that you would be ahead of the main escort." He listed them. 6 people. His father's head of security. 2 senior council members. His personal attendant. The captain of his escort, who had not survived the ambush. And the beta representative of the Ironvale Pack, who had been present at the route planning meeting as part of the ongoing Outer Pack liaison protocols. He stopped. Adela looked at the map. She had spent 5 years diagnosing things. Not just wounds and fevers, causes, origins, the invisible thread that connected a symptom to its source. A rash that wasn't a rash but a reaction to something in the water supply. A recurring injury that wasn't clumsiness but a structural problem with the training ground floor. She had learned to follow threads backward through evidence until she arrived at the thing no one had thought to look for, or the thing everyone had decided not to name. She followed this thread now. The route was specific, not a main road, not a predictable path, but the particular shortcut that Thomas had chosen that morning on instinct. Except someone had known he would choose it. Wolves who had been waiting there for hours didn't arrive on instinct. They arrived on information. The attackers had not been from any pack affiliated with the crown. The poison compound on their blades was a formulation she recognized from her own training, a specific blend used in the outer territories, difficult to source closer to the palace, common enough in the far packs that its presence alone wouldn't point anywhere specific. But combined with the route, combined with the meeting, combined with the fact that the exile of a pack healer who had stumbled across the heir dying in the forest was being handled not by the pack elder but personally, furiously, by the beta who had reported her before dawn had finished breaking. "Marin Voss," Adela said. She said it quietly, the same way she would name a toxin she'd identified in a wound. Not an accusation, a diagnosis. Thomas didn't answer for long enough that the fire popped twice in the silence. "She has been pushing against the consolidation protocols for 2 years," he said finally, his voice careful and flat in the way of someone choosing each word with both hands. "If my father completes the crowning and the outer packs fall under direct crown jurisdiction, her position loses most of its authority. The Ironvale Beta controls 3 border territories under the current arrangement. Under the new one, she controls none. So she needed you gone before the crowning," Adela said. "Yes," and she needed anyone who might connect her to the ambush gone as well. The silence this time was different. Thomas looked at her with something that had moved past the evaluating steadiness she'd gotten used to and into something rawer and more urgent. "Adela," he said. "She's already traveling here," Adela said. She had worked it out 3 sentences ago and had kept talking to give herself time to decide how she felt about it, which she still hadn't. "She's not coming as a suspect. She's coming as a witness." A concerned Beta reporting the suspicious behavior of an exiled healer who disappeared into the forest with the missing heir. She paused. "It's a good position. I would be worried about it if I were her." Thomas stood up. "I'll tell my father tonight." "You have no proof," Adela said. "Neither do I. Everything I've just told you is inference. Good inference, but inference. She'll have answers for all of it, and I'll have nothing but the word of an outcast who, according to her version of events, has every reason to deflect suspicion." She looked at the map one more time and then folded it along its creases. "We need proof, which means we need time. She arrives in 2 days, Thomas said. "I know," Adela said. She handed him back the map. Their fingers overlapped on the edge of it for a moment, his grip tightening slightly before she let go, an involuntary thing like reflex. She stood, straightened her borrowed palace clothes, and moved toward the door. "Get some sleep," she said. "You think worse when you're tired. I've observed this." Behind her she heard something that might, in another person, have been a short, reluctant breath of a laugh. She did not let herself smile until she was in the corridor. Marin Voss arrived looking like concern. That was what Adela noticed first, from the upper corridor where she had positioned herself to watch the arrival without being visible in it. The careful construction of the woman's presentation. The travel-worn cloak that was just worn enough to suggest urgency without suggesting disarray. The expression arranged into the specific configuration of someone who had ridden hard out of worry and was relieved, deeply relieved, to find the situation partially resolved. She descended from her horse and was greeted by the palace steward and spoke to him for approximately 2 minutes. And whatever she said in those 2 minutes had him nodding with the grave attention of a man receiving important information. By dinner, the shape of it had moved through the court like weather. Adela didn't attend dinner. She had never been comfortable in the Great Hall. Too many people performing too many things at once. And she was always acutely aware that her presence there was conditional, extended as a courtesy to the heir's unusual request rather than as a right she held herself. She ate in the small room off the healer's wing and heard the shape of Marin's account in fragments from the kitchen girl who brought her tray. Not the words, but the tone of it, the slight careful distance in the girl's manner that had not been there the day before. The formal summons came the following morning. The inquiry room was oak-paneled and lamplit and contained the Alpha King, 2 senior council members, the head of palace security, and Marin Voss, who stood with her hands folded and her face composed into an expression of such reluctant, compassionate certainty that Adela had to remind herself to keep breathing evenly. The account was exactly as she had predicted. Polished, internally consistent, devastating in its generosity. Marin never called her a criminal, never raised her voice, never said anything that could be directly refuted. She spoke of Adela with the careful sympathy of someone who understood how desperation worked, how an exiled girl with no home and no prospects might see an opportunity in a vulnerable, injured boy and make choices that were perhaps not malicious, exactly, but certainly not innocent. She mentioned the 5 days in the forest. She mentioned the absence of any immediate attempt to alert the crown. She mentioned, with a small, pained pause, that the Iron Veil pack had not exiled Adela without cause, and that the same impulsiveness that had led to her exile had perhaps led to this. Adela stated her account. She stated it clearly and without embellishment, because embellishment would not help her and she knew it. She had no proof. When it was over, the head of security informed her, in the courteous tone of someone delivering an outcome that had been decided before she entered the room, that she would be confined to her palace chambers pending full inquiry. For her own protection, he said, as much as for the integrity of the process. Her chamber door locked from the outside. She discovered this when she tried it 20 minutes later. She sat on the edge of the bed, which was the finest bed she had ever been in and which she was entirely unable to appreciate, and looked at the wall and thought with great precision about her situation. No allies. No rank. No proof. A locked door between her and any possibility of gathering either. Marin had moved quickly and well, and Adela could admire the architecture of it even while it was closing around her. She did not hear from Thomas that day, or the following morning. On the second afternoon, one of the younger kitchen staff, a girl who had been friendly before, who sometimes paused to talk when she brought meals, slid the tray through the door without speaking and would not meet Adela's eyes. Adela asked, quietly, if she knew anything about the heir's response to the inquiry. The girl hesitated. Then she said, carefully, that the young lord had been in meetings with his father's advisors all morning, that there had been considerable discussion about the crowning timeline, that the advisors were of the opinion that any public statement from the heir on behalf of an accused outcast would reflect poorly on his judgment at a particularly sensitive moment, and that his father had agreed it was wisest, for now, to allow the inquiry to proceed without interference. The door closed. Adela sat with that for a long time. She had not expected rescue. She had never, in her life, built anything on the expectation of rescue. But there was a difference between not expecting something and learning that it had been considered and set aside, and she found she was not, in fact, entirely prepared for the distance between those two things. She looked at the locked door. She had been foolish to stay. She could see that now, with the particular clarity that arrived when all the warmth had gone out of a situation and you could finally see its actual shape. She had stayed because Thomas had asked her to, because the Alpha King's nod had felt like enough, because something in the past weeks had begun to feel, dangerously, irresponsibly, like it might become solid ground. She should have recognized it for what it was. She of all people should have known. Useful. Never wanted. She pulled her knees to her chest, put her back against the headboard of the finest bed she had ever sat on, and did not cry, because crying required a surplus of feeling she could not currently afford. Outside the locked door, the palace continued its business. She heard it in pieces. That was the thing about locked rooms. People forgot you were in them or stopped caring, and the door was oak but not thick enough to be truly silent, and Adela had spent 5 years learning to read patients who couldn't speak. She knew how to listen to what wasn't being said directly. She knew how to hold fragments up against each other until the shape between them became visible. The first fragment came from 2 guards changing shift on the evening before the crowning. A brief exchange about the expanded gate roster, the number of outer pack representatives who had arrived as official ceremony witnesses, the unusual decision to allow beta-ranked attendants into the inner palace corridors rather than holding them in the outer reception halls as protocol dictated. One of the guards thought this was generous. The other thought it was above his rank to have an opinion. Adela sat very still on the other side of the door and began to think. The second fragment came at midnight from a palace official moving quickly down the corridor, speaking in low tones to a companion about a last-minute adjustment to the ceremony's security positioning. Several of the Crown's regular inner guard had been reassigned to outer gate management to accommodate the volume of arriving witnesses, leaving the throne room itself covered by a reduced rotation. The third fragment came from the kitchen girl in the morning, who was not unfriendly so much as frightened, and who let slip while sliding through the breakfast tray that it felt strange, didn't it, how many Ironvale wolves had come for the crowning, more than any other pack by a wide margin, and they were all so quiet, not celebrating, just positioned. The word she used was positioned. She said it like she didn't know why she'd chosen it and then left quickly. Adela sat with all 3 fragments and followed the thread. Marin had never needed the inquiry to succeed. The inquiry was not the point. The inquiry was the mechanism that put Adela behind a locked door and kept Thomas occupied in advisor meetings and focused the palace's attention on a contained, manageable political dispute. While Marin used her status as the inquiry's key witness to move freely through the inner palace with an escort of loyal Ironvale wolves who had arrived as ceremony witnesses and been granted inner corridor access by a protocol exception that Marin herself had almost certainly requested through the appropriate channels weeks in advance. The crowning ceremony put the heir in a fixed position at a predetermined time with reduced inner guard coverage, and every senior palace official focused on the ritual. It was not a political move. It was a second ambush. Adela looked at the door. The lock was a standard interior bolt, heavy, but interior. The palace had not built these rooms to hold prisoners. They had built them for guests, and the locks were meant to provide privacy rather than security. She had noticed, on her third day of confinement, that the hinges were on her side of the door. She had not done anything with that information at the time because she had still been deciding whether she was going to continue making decisions that caused her significant personal consequences. She had apparently decided. She worked the hinge pins out with the metal clasp from her satchel, the satchel they had not thought to take from her, which was a mistake of the kind people made when they underestimated what a healer carried. Took 11 minutes. The door came free from the frame on her side, and she caught its weight before it could make noise and leaned it carefully against the wall. The corridor was empty. She moved through the palace the way she had learned over the past weeks. The servant routes, the back staircases, the narrow passage behind the kitchen annex that deposited her into the east wing without passing through any of the main corridors where ceremony guests were assembling. She was in plain clothes, her dark hair loose, and she looked like staff moving with purpose, which was what she had always looked like, in every place she had ever been. She heard the ceremony begin, the formal resonance of the opening proclamation carrying through the stone, and she moved faster. The throne room doors were partially open for the processional airflow. She could see the assembled court, the Alpha King at the front, Thomas on the dais in ceremonial dress with his back straight and his face composed into the careful expression of someone performing something important. She could see the inner guard positions reduced, redistributed. She could see the Iron Veil wolves distributed through the witness ranks with that quality the kitchen girl had named exactly right. Positioned. And she could see, near the side entrance behind the throne, a palace official moving with quiet urgency toward the head of the remaining inner guard, carrying a document with a seal she recognized from across the room. Recognized because she had studied it, because she had learned it, because it was the seal that had been on every piece of Marin Voss's official correspondence since she arrived. A forged order, delivered under cover of ceremony, to the one guard rotation that stood between the heir and the wolves that had been waiting, patient as professionals, for the room to be arranged exactly like this. Adela walked through the throne room doors. She said, "Stop." Not loudly. She didn't need loud. The acoustics of the throne room were extraordinary, which she suspected was the architectural point, and her voice carried the way it always did when she had decided something completely. The official with the document stopped. The guard he'd been approaching stopped. Several hundred assembled court members turned to look at the woman standing in the doorway in plain clothes with forest mud still in the seams of her boots. The silence was immediate and total. Adela walked into it. She kept her eyes on the official with the document and spoke to the room at the same time, because she had one chance at this and she was not going to waste it on indirection. She said that the document being carried toward the inner guard rotation bore a forged seal. She said that the order it contained, whatever its specific language, was designed to remove or reassign the guard coverage around the heir at the precise moment when a prepositioned faction of Iron Veil wolves, she gestured toward the witness ranks without looking away from the document, had been placed to take advantage of that gap. She said that this was not a political dispute about an exiled healer. It was the second attempt on the life of the Alpha King's heir, and the first one had happened on a road in the forest, and she had been there for the aftermath, and she would describe it in whatever detail the court required. The room did not move. Marin Voss, from somewhere in the assembled crowd, said her name in a tone of measured, sorrowful patience, the tone of someone managing a situation they had prepared for. And then Thomas stepped off the dais. He didn't ask permission. He didn't look at his father or his advisors. He walked across the throne room floor in his ceremonial clothes and came to stand beside her, which was not a small thing in a room full of people who understood exactly what it meant for the heir to physically align himself with an accused outcast during his own crowning ceremony. He stood there for a moment. Then he turned to face the court, and when he spoke, his voice had the same quality it had carried in the cave. Plain, undecorated. the voice of someone who had decided that the only useful thing was the exact truth. He described the ambush, the road, the timing, the wolves who had been waiting with the prepositioned patience of people who knew the schedule. He described 2 days of running wounded through the forest, the poison spreading, the cold. He described a cave at the edge of pack territory and a girl who had built a fire with nothing and cleaned his wounds with her last supplies and talked to him through 4 days of fever because she believed patients healed faster when they heard a voice. He said she had never asked him who he was. She had helped him because he was breathing and she was a healer and those were, to her, sufficient conditions. He said she had been exiled for it before dawn the following morning. He said he had said nothing to the court in the days since her confinement, and that this was a failure he would not compound by continuing it. The room was very quiet. The Alpha King stood. He looked at the official with the document who surrendered it without being asked. He looked at his head of security, who moved without needing to be told, toward the Ironvale wolves in the witness ranks, toward the side entrance where Marin's closest attendants had begun, too late, to reassess their positioning. He looked at Marin Voss, who had composed her face into something that might have been innocence if the room hadn't just heard everything it had heard, and he held her gaze for exactly long enough that she understood what was coming. He said, "Take her." The court watched Marin Voss be removed from the room she had spent weeks maneuvering herself into. She did not speak. That, Adela thought, was perhaps the most revealing thing about her. She had always known that the words were only useful while the position held. The Alpha King looked at Adela. For seconds, as before. But different this time, the question behind his eyes had resolved into something that looked more like recognition. He said, "Name your reward." Adela had not prepared for this part. She had prepared for the part where she walked into the room and said the true thing and whatever happened after happened. She was tired and her heart was still beating too fast and Thomas was standing close enough beside her that she could feel the warmth of him, and she did not want a reward. She said, "I don't want a reward. I want a place that's actually mine." The Alpha King looked at her for a moment longer. Then he nodded once. It was enough. She had learned, a long time ago, to recognize when something was enough and to let it be. She stayed. Not dramatically. Not with ceremony or announcement or any of the formal apparatus the palace seemed to apply to everything else that happened within its walls. She simply remained, in the healer's wing, in the small workroom off the east corridor that had been emptied of its storage crates and given over to her use, at the long table where she spent her mornings cataloging the palace's medical stores, which were extensive and poorly organized and had apparently been that way for years without anyone finding it sufficiently problematic to address. She found it problematic. She addressed it. That was, in the end, what the Alpha King's nod had meant. Not a gift, not a charity placement, but a recognition that the palace had a healer-shaped gap and she was a healer-shaped person and he was a practical man who didn't waste resources. She was answerable to him directly, which meant she was not answerable to the court's opinion of her, which was the specific arrangement she would have designed herself if anyone had asked. No one had asked. He had simply structured it correctly, which she respected. The Ironvale pack came under formal royal oversight 6 weeks after the crowning. She heard about it from Thomas, who told her with the careful neutrality of someone reporting a fact rather than seeking a reaction. The outer pack territories were being integrated under the new jurisdictional framework, the thing that Marin Voss had gone to considerable lengths to prevent, and which was now proceeding precisely because Marin Voss was no longer in a position to prevent anything. Adela received this information and noted it and returned to the compound she was grinding, because there was nothing useful to feel about it that she hadn't already felt. Sarah arrived on a Tuesday. Adela looked up from her workroom to find her standing in the doorway with a travel bag over one shoulder and an expression caught between relief and the effort of not crying, and Adela set down her pestle and crossed the room and held on for considerably longer than 3 seconds this time. Sarah had been given a position in the palace kitchens. Good work, steady, within walking distance. She said she didn't know who had arranged it. Adela suspected she did know and chose not to say, because Thomas had clearly also decided not to say, and there was a particular kind of kindness in the thing being done without requiring anyone to perform gratitude for it.
sera crié anyway.
Adela allowed it, which for her was a significant concession. She thought about the cave sometimes. Not with pain, exactly, more with the particular quality of attention she gave to things that had been formative and were now complete. She had heard, through the practical channels of palace information, that the Alpha King had issued a formal designation for the site, a marker placed at the tree line, the area entered into official record. She did not know what language the designation used. She suspected it was bureaucratic and insufficient. The cave had been, for 5 days, the only place in the world where she had existed entirely on her own terms, accountable to nothing but what was true and what was necessary. No amount of official language was going to capture that correctly, and she had made her peace with that. The healer's garden was her favorite part of the palace. She had claimed it by degrees, first just using it, then quietly expanding what grew there, then spending evenings on the stone bench at its far end when the work was done and the light was going and the cold had gentled into something almost comfortable. It was not the forest, but it had that quality she needed: open sky, growing things, the sense of being outside the machinery of the palace without being outside the walls. Thomas found her there on an evening in late thaw, when the snow had receded to the shadowed edges of the garden, and the first things were beginning to push up through the dark soil with the stubborn optimism of plants that didn't negotiate with weather. He sat down beside her without asking, which was something he had always done and which she had always not minded, which probably said something. He didn't speak for a long time. Neither did she. The garden settled around them in the particular easy silence that had developed somewhere between a cave and a map and a throne room floor. Then he said quietly, "You didn't leave," she had said obviously the first time. It had been the right answer then. Clean and honest and closed. A door shut on sentiment she hadn't been ready to hold. She was readier now. "I know," she said. He looked at her. She looked back. The last of the winter light moved through the garden and caught the edges of things and made them briefly gold. She had never belonged to a place before. She understood, sitting in the garden with the cold going soft around them and Thomas Boyd not saying anything else because he didn't need to, that belonging was not a thing that was given to you by people who had decided you were worth it. It was a thing you built, out of whatever you carried, in whatever cave you found. The winter was finally over.